On my 68th birthday, I thought life had already taught me every possible lesson. I believed I knew the faces of love, loyalty, and betrayal. I thought sickness would be the hardest test I would ever face, a reminder of how fragile this body has become with the passing years. But I was wrong. The day I was admitted to the hospital, weak and exhausted, became the moment when I discovered the truth I had ignored for far too long. It wasn't my illness that broke me, it was what I saw inside those sterile white walls, in a place where love is supposed to show itself the most. That day, my husband revealed who he truly was, not with words but with actions, and those actions cut deeper than any medical diagnosis ever could. It began simply, a fever that wouldn't go away, a dizziness that made me stumble as I walked through the kitchen, a pounding headache that forced me to sit down before I collapsed. I brushed it off, thinking it was just age catching up with me. I've always been the type of woman who puts everyone else first: my children, my grandchildren, and especially my husband. My health, my needs, my comfort always came second. But this time, my body refused to be ignored. I was rushed to the hospital, and for the first time in a long time, I had no choice but to think of myself. As I lay in that hospital bed, with the machines humming beside me and the scent of disinfectant filling the air, I waited. I waited for him. My husband, the man I believed would hold my hand through sickness and health, the man who once promised to be my partner in all things, for better or worse. I told myself he would rush in at any moment, his face filled with worry, his voice trembling as he asked me how I was feeling. I pictured him setting his jacket on the chair beside my bed, refusing to leave my side until the doctors assured him I was safe. But the hours passed. The walls of the room grew colder, the silence heavier. My phone remained still, not a single message lighting up the screen. I told myself he was busy, maybe stuck in traffic, maybe handling something important at work. I gave him excuses, because that's what I had always done, given him the benefit of the doubt. Still, deep down, an unease began to grow inside me, one I couldn't quite shake. It was as if my body knew the truth before my heart was ready to accept it. Then, late that evening, I heard footsteps outside my room. My heart leapt, ready to forgive the delay, ready to feel comfort at last. But when I looked through the crack in the door, what I saw wasn't love or loyalty. It was betrayal, dressed as care. My husband wasn't there to see me, he was there to see someone else. He walked past my room without even glancing inside, carrying flowers, his voice low but affectionate as he asked the nurse about another patient. And that's when I heard it. He introduced her not as a stranger, not as a colleague, but as his cousin. His cousin. 2 words that made my blood run cold, because in my decades of marriage, I had never once heard of such a cousin. That moment became the beginning of my awakening. It was no longer about being sick, it was about being blind. I had given my life, my loyalty, and my faith to a man who could walk right past me in my weakest hour and pour his care into someone else. That was the real sickness, and the cure would not come from medicine but from truth. Sometimes it takes the quiet of a hospital room to hear the loudest betrayal of all. I remember lying there in that bed, the thin hospital sheets tucked around me as if they were meant to protect me from the truth creeping into my bones. Hospitals have a strange way of stripping you down to your most vulnerable state. The beeping of the monitors, the fluorescent lights humming above, the constant shuffle of nurses moving quickly from room to room, it all reminds you that you're just another body, another case, another fragile human trying to cling to dignity while the world moves on. And yet, as fragile as I felt that day, I didn't know the real break wasn't in my body, but in the foundation of my marriage. My illness was simply the curtain that lifted to reveal the play behind it, the one that had been rehearsed for years in whispers and secrets, far away from my naive trust. The fever had burned through me the night before, leaving my skin clammy and my throat raw. I had always prided myself on being strong, the one who didn't complain, the one who kept moving even when her body begged her to stop. But that morning, I couldn't stand. My knees buckled beneath me in the kitchen, and I clutched a counter to stop myself from falling. My daughter, who happened to be visiting, insisted on taking me to the hospital, and I reluctantly agreed. I thought it would be routine, some fluids, some rest, a doctor's instructions to take better care of myself. I never imagined it would become the stage for betrayal so sharp it would pierce through decades of loyalty. As they wheeled me through the long corridors, I looked at the other patients. Some had families gathered around them, holding their hands, whispering prayers, wiping their brows with gentle cloths. I told myself that would be me too soon. That once my husband heard, he would come running. I pictured him storming through those doors, his tie loosened, his eyes wide with worry, asking the doctors to save me at any cost. I pictured him leaning down to kiss my forehead, whispering, "Don't you dare leave me." Those were the fantasies I clung to as the needle pierced my skin. But fantasies are nothing compared to reality, and reality has a cruel way of tearing down the walls you build to protect your heart. The hours stretched like years. My daughter left to pick up her children, promising to return, and I was left alone with the ticking clock on the wall. Every sound in the hallway made me lift my head, my heart leaping, expecting him. A shadow at the door, footsteps passing by, voices calling names. It was always someone else, never him. And with each passing moment, I found myself rehearsing excuses for him. Maybe he hadn't gotten the call. Maybe he was tied up at work. Maybe he was trying to arrange something, flowers or a surprise, something to make me feel cherished in my weakness. It is a dangerous thing, the way love can blind us. We paint over cracks until the entire wall collapses, and then we are left standing in the rubble, asking how we never saw it coming. By evening, the loneliness pressed down heavier than the fever. The nurse came in to check my vitals, her smile warm but professional. I asked if anyone had asked for me, if perhaps my husband was waiting at the desk. She shook her head gently and patted my arm, the way you pat a child who is frightened of the dark. That simple gesture, that sympathy in her eyes, stung more than the needle in my vein. It meant she knew something I hadn't admitted to myself yet, that I was alone, even when I wasn't supposed to be. Then it happened, the moment that shifted my world forever. I heard his voice. I knew it instantly, the deep, smooth tone that had once soothed me on restless nights, the voice that had made promises of forever. My heart raced, my lips parted to call his name. I was ready to forgive his absence, ready to let go of the hours of silence, ready to just feel his presence beside me. But as I leaned toward the door, I froze, because his voice wasn't speaking about me. It was asking about someone else, a woman. He called her his cousin, his tone filled with tenderness, and he carried flowers in his hand, flowers that weren't meant for me. I watched through the narrow opening of the door as he walked past my room without even glancing inside. My breath caught in my throat, my chest tightened, and suddenly the four in my arm felt like chains keeping me from running after him, demanding answers. But even if I could have spoken, even if I could have screamed his name, what would I have said? That after all these years of loyalty, of sacrifice, of putting his needs above my own, I was nothing more than an afterthought, that I was invisible in the moment I needed him most. The truth was already there in front of me, undeniable. He wasn't mine in the way I had believed. He hadn't been for a long time. I sank back into the bed, my eyes burning with tears that refused to fall. There was a dignity in holding them back, in refusing to let the nurses or the strangers walking by see me broken. But inside, something was shattering. Memories of our life together flashed like cruel photographs in my mind, the wedding vows whispered with trembling voices, the laughter of our children as we built a home, the quiet evenings where I believed we were safe in each other's arms. All of it now tainted, all of it now stained by the sight of him walking past me with flowers for another woman. And yet, I couldn't help but think of myself, of how I had given so much, how I had shaped my life around him, how I had silenced my doubts every time something didn't add up. This wasn't just about him betraying me, it was about me betraying myself by refusing to see. That was the hardest truth of all. Because when you give everything to someone else, and they choose someone over you, the question isn't only why did he, but also why did I let him? That night, as the lights dimmed and the hospital grew quieter, I stared at the ceiling and felt a storm rising inside me. Anger, sorrow, humiliation, but also clarity. Clarity that comes only when you've been stripped bare of illusions. He thought I was too weak to notice, too dependent to challenge him, too fragile to walk away. But he had underestimated me. This sickness may have made my body weak, but it had awakened a strength in my soul I didn't know existed. And I knew one thing with certainty. The woman he was visiting wasn't his cousin, and the life I thought I had was not the life I truly lived. The question that burned in my heart was simple: what would I do now that I knew? What would I choose for myself, for the dignity I had lost piece by piece over the years? If you were lying in that hospital bed, overhearing your spouse call another woman family while ignoring you, what would you do? Confront them immediately, or stay silent and plan your next move? Silence has a way of screaming louder than words. That night in the hospital, the silence between me and my husband became the sharpest betrayal of all. He didn't need to raise his voice. He didn't need to argue with me or dismiss me face to face. He did something worse. He simply walked past me, as if I didn't exist, as if I were invisible in the very moment when I needed him most. That absence, that deliberate act of choosing someone else while I lay sick and waiting, tore into me deeper than any insult ever could. I stayed in my bed, listening to the echo of his footsteps fading down the hall. The sound of his voice carried faintly from another room, warm, gentle, filled with an affection I hadn't heard from him in years. And that was the dagger. He still had it in him: kindness, care, tenderness. He just chose to give it to someone else, while I was left with the sterile hum of the machines and the quiet ache of my own heart. I wanted to get up, to tear out the 4 in my arm, to march down that hallway and confront him, to demand answers, to force him to look me in the eye and explain why, in my hour of weakness, he found the strength to comfort another woman but not me. But my body wouldn't let me. Fever still clung to my skin, dizziness blurred my vision, and the very thing that had brought me there, my frailty, kept me prisoner in that bed. And maybe that was a cruel blessing, because in my stillness, I was able to see everything clearly, stripped of excuses and illusions. Lying there, I thought of all the times I had silenced my suspicions. Late nights at work that didn't make sense, phone calls he stepped outside to take, sudden bursts of irritation when I asked simple questions. I had brushed them aside, telling myself I was imagining things, that I was paranoid, that after decades of marriage, trust was more important than suspicion. But trust, I realized, had been one-sided. I had carried it faithfully, like a torch through the darkness, while he had snuffed his out long ago and left me wandering blind. The betrayal wasn't just what I saw that day, it was the accumulation of years of lies I refused to see. That was the silent betrayal, the one that crept in quietly and made a home inside my marriage, while I smiled, cooked dinners, washed clothes, and believed I was safe. It wasn't just his silence that broke me. It was mine. My silence every time I bit my tongue instead of questioning. My silence every time I turned away from my own instincts. My silence every time I chose peace over truth. But that night, something inside me shifted. Silence would no longer be my prison, it would become my weapon. I decided not to confront him immediately. I would not stumble into his lies while he was still confident enough to tell them. No. I would wait. I would watch. I would gather every detail, every slip of the tongue, every moment of contradiction. If he thought I was too weak to notice, then let him think it. If he thought my illness blinded me, then let him underestimate me. Because in my silence, I was building strength. The next morning, when he finally stepped into my room, his face painted with the mask of concern, I watched him closely. He kissed my forehead as if nothing had happened, as if he hadn't walked past me the night before, as if I hadn't heard him calling another woman his cousin. He asked how I was feeling, his voice smooth, rehearsed, careful, and I played along. I told him I was tired but better. I smiled faintly, letting him believe I was still the trusting wife he had always known. But inside, the storm had already begun. I noticed the details he didn't think I would see. The faint perfume clinging to his shirt, not mine. The quick glance at his phone when it buzzed in his pocket. The way he silenced it immediately, the nervous tap of his fingers against the betrayal as he sat beside me. He thought he was covering his tracks, but every movement, every pause, every choice betrayed him more than words ever could. As the days passed, I let him live in his comfort. I let him believe he was in control. He visited me when it was convenient, brought me small gifts, offered shallow smiles. But when he thought I was asleep, I saw the way he stared at the door, as if itching to leave, as if someone else was waiting for him. That was the true betrayal, not just that he gave his heart to another, but that he no longer cared enough to hide it well. He assumed I wouldn't see. He assumed I wouldn't act. He assumed my silence was ignorance. But silence can be dangerous. Silence is where plans are born. I began to piece together the fragments of his lies, each moment like a puzzle fitting into place. The late-night absences, the sudden business trips, the secretive texts, it all made sense now. And I realized something that chilled me to the bone. This wasn't new. This wasn't the first time. This had been happening for years, right under my nose, and I had been too blinded by love, too eager to keep peace, too afraid of what the truth would mean, to face it. That realization was both devastating and liberating. Devastating because it meant the marriage I thought I had was a lie. Liberating because it meant I no longer had to carry the weight of pretending. For the first time in years, I saw clearly, and clarity is the first step to freedom. I stayed silent, but inside, I was screaming. Screaming at myself for accepting less than I deserved. Screaming at him for believing I would never wake up to the truth. Screaming at the years I had wasted believing his promises. But that scream, though silent, was powerful. It filled me with resolve. It told me I was done being the woman who looked the other way. That is the cruel beauty of silent betrayal. It hurts more than words, cuts deeper than arguments, but it also teaches you more than any fight ever could. It teaches you to listen not to what is said, but to what is hidden. It teaches you that love without respect is just a performance. It teaches you that silence can be deadly not just when it hides betrayal, but when it awakens strength. And as I lay there, watching him slip into his lies with ease, I promised myself this: the next time silence spoke, it would not be his, it would be mine. And it would be the silence that ends everything. If you discovered betrayal in silence, would you confront immediately and demand the truth, or would you wait, stay quiet, and let them trap themselves in their own lies? The hospital is not the kind of place where you expect to discover betrayal. It's a place where pain is supposed to draw people closer, where the fragility of life reminds us of the bonds that hold us together. At least, that's what I thought. I believed my sickness would inspire compassion, a reminder to my husband of the vows he once made, to stand by me in sickness and in health. But what I found instead was a betrayal so bitter, so blatant, that even my fever could not numb the sting of it. It happened 2 days into my stay. My strength was slowly returning, though my body still felt heavy, as if gravity itself had doubled its weight. The nurses encouraged me to take short walks down the hallway to rebuild stamina, and though every step felt like a mountain, I agreed. I told myself it was just a stroll, a chance to see more than the 4 white walls of my room. But deep inside, something urged me forward, as if instinct knew what my eyes were about to witness. The hallway smelled faintly of antiseptic and coffee, the scent of exhaustion carried by overworked staff. My hand clung to the 4-pole, its wheels squeaking softly as it rolled beside me. I shuffled slowly, head low, until I heard it, his laugh. My husband's laugh. That sound, once so familiar, once the music of my happiest days, now felt foreign, sharp, almost cruel. I froze in place, every nerve in my body alert. It came from just a few rooms down, muffled by a door left slightly ajar. At first, I thought maybe he had finally come to see me, that he had stopped to greet a nurse on his way to my side. I wanted to believe that. I wanted to believe that my hope hadn't been misplaced. But curiosity, or perhaps something deeper, pulled me toward that door. I crept closer, my steps slow, my heart pounding, until I could peer inside. And what I saw shattered every illusion I had left. There he was, sitting comfortably in a chair beside a bed. But it wasn't my bed. And it wasn't me he was visiting. It was her, the woman he called his cousin. She looked far too comfortable, her hair neatly brushed back, a smile tugging at her lips as she listened to him. And he wasn't just present. He was devoted. His body leaned toward her, his hand resting over hers with a familiarity that had nothing to do with family ties. "Don't worry. I'll be here as long as you need me," he whispered. I heard it as clearly as if he had said it into my own ear. My stomach churned, my throat tightened, and suddenly I understood everything. The flowers on the table beside her, the extra pillow fluff behind her back, the way he gazed at her as if she were the center of his universe. Those gestures were meant for her, not me. And yet, the audacity of it all was what burned most. He had the courage to walk past my room, knowing I was weak and waiting, just to pour his love into someone else's cup. He had the audacity to label her as family, knowing I had never once in our marriage heard her name before. It was betrayal dressed up in excuses, wrapped in a thin veil of lies he thought would never unravel. But lies always do. I stood there unnoticed, watching the man I had trusted with my life act as if I didn't exist, watching him offer tenderness to another while I clung to the hospital wall for balance, watching him betray vows whispered decades ago, promises I had carried like scripture in my heart. It was like seeing a stranger where my husband should have been. And the worst part was realizing that stranger had probably been there all along, hiding in plain sight behind a mask of loyalty. I didn't storm into the room. I didn't shout or demand answers. My body wouldn't have allowed it, and my spirit knew better. Instead, I stepped back quietly, retreating to my own room with each step feeling heavier than the last. I lay down on the bed, my pulse still racing, my mind replaying the scene over and over again. His laughter, his touch, his lies. Each memory pierced me, each thought cutting deeper than the fever ever could. For hours, I stared at the ceiling, consumed by a storm of emotions. Anger, hurt, disbelief, shame. The shame of realizing that I had been blind for so long, that the signs had been there and I had chosen to ignore them. The shame of giving my loyalty to a man who couldn't even offer me honesty in return. And yet, beneath it all, there was something else growing: clarity. A bitter kind of clarity, but clarity nonetheless. I saw him for who he truly was. Not the man I had loved, not the husband I had built a life with, but a coward hiding behind lies, a man too weak to be honest, too selfish to give me the dignity I deserved. And as painful as that truth was, it was also liberating. Because once you see someone clearly, once the mask is ripped away, you can never be deceived again. The next time he visited my room, pretending to be the concerned husband, I watched him carefully. He brought me flowers too, almost as if to balance the scales. His smile was practiced, his words carefully chosen. "You're looking better," he said softly, placing the bouquet on the table. I thanked him, but my eyes never left his face. I searched for guilt, for cracks in his performance, and I saw them. The slight hesitation in his voice, the way he avoided my gaze, the stiffness in his movements. He knew, on some level, he knew I had seen. But I said nothing. Not yet. Because betrayal, I realized, is best answered not in haste, but in patience. He thought he was winning, thought he was untouchable. But I knew the truth now, and the truth is power. And power, when held in silence, can be the sharpest blade of all. That night, alone again in the sterile quiet of my room, I whispered to myself a promise. I would not let his betrayal define me. I would not let his lies break me. I would gather strength, I would hold on to dignity, and when the time was right, he would learn that even the weakest woman can rise stronger than any betrayal. If you caught your partner showing tenderness to someone else while you were sick and waiting for them, would you confront them immediately, or would you wait and use their lies against them later? The images of that hospital hallway wouldn't leave my mind. They replayed themselves like a cruel film stuck on loop, each frame sharper, each detail louder than the last. His laugh, the way his hand rested over hers, the softness in his voice when he called her his cousin. I had always believed that betrayal came in storms with screaming, slammed doors, accusations thrown like daggers. But this was a quiet storm, one that built itself slowly over years of neglect. Until the lightning finally revealed what had been brewing all along. And once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. Lying in that hospital bed, I began to remember things differently. Memories I had once brushed aside, excuses I had once made for him, now returned with clarity so piercing it left me breathless. It was like puzzle pieces clicking into place, forming a picture I had refused to acknowledge. I thought of the nights he claimed to be working late, the smell of unfamiliar perfume that sometimes clung faintly to his jacket when he returned home. How he would grow irritated when I asked too many questions, dismissing me with a wave of his hand or a cold look that made me retreat into silence. I had told myself back then that I was imagining things, that age had made me insecure, that marriage after decades wasn't supposed to feel like young love anymore. But now, with the truth exposed, I realized those moments weren't paranoia, they were warnings. I remember dinners where I sat across from him, speaking about my day, my dreams, my worries, only to see his eyes drift down to his phone, his attention swallowed by messages I was never allowed to see. "Just work," he would say curtly, locking the screen before sliding it into his pocket. And I believed him, because to question him meant disrupting the fragile peace of our home. It was easier to swallow my doubt than to risk the silence that followed his anger. Then there were the anniversaries forgotten, the birthdays brushed off with hurried excuses. He always had a reason: meetings, deadlines, travel. I told myself he was just busy, that he loved me even if he didn't always show it. But now I saw the truth. He wasn't too busy to celebrate. He was just celebrating with someone else. The flashbacks bled into one another, years collapsing into a single realization. He hadn't loved me the way I loved him for a very long time. And the worst part wasn't that he betrayed me. It was that I had betrayed myself by choosing not to see it. I had sacrificed my voice, my instincts, my needs, all in the name of keeping our marriage intact. I had convinced myself that silence was strength, that loyalty meant endurance no matter the cost. But endurance without respect is just slow destruction. I thought of all the sacrifices I had made over the years. The nights I stayed awake sewing clothes to save money. The double shifts I worked so he wouldn't feel the weight of bills. The vacations I never took. The dreams I postponed. Also that our children and he could have more than I ever did. And while I poured myself into building a life, he was pouring himself into lies. That contrast hit me like a blow to the chest. I remembered the way he used to look at me in the early years, how his eyes lit up when I entered the room, how his hand found mine even in silence. Somewhere along the way, that man had disappeared. Or maybe he had just hidden behind a mask, one I was too blinded by love to remove. The truth was, I had been living beside a stranger for longer than I cared to admit. As I stared at the ceiling in that hospital room, the bitterness of those memories stung sharper than the needle in my arm. I realized how much of myself I had given away in small pieces, never asking for anything in return. And when you give yourself away like that, when you strip your soul down to the bone for someone else's comfort, you don't just lose them, you lose yourself. That realization terrified me, more than the betrayal itself. But it also lit a fire inside me. Because once you see how much you've lost, you also see how much you can still take back. Betrayal doesn't just destroy, it awakens. It wakes you up to truths you've ignored, to strength you didn't know you had, to the value you forgot was yours. He thought he had broken me by choosing another woman, by showing me in the cruelest way possible that I was no longer enough for him. But in reality, he had given me a gift: clarity. And clarity is dangerous to a liar. I began to think of every time I had chosen silence over confrontation, and I promised myself I would never make that mistake again. Not because I wanted revenge, but because I owed it to myself to stop living in the shadows of his excuses. I had been invisible long enough. The bitterness of those flashbacks fueled me. They reminded me that I wasn't just a victim, I was a survivor of years of quiet neglect. I wasn't just the woman lying in a hospital bed, waiting for scraps of affection. I was the woman who had carried an entire family on her shoulders, who had sacrificed dreams for stability, who had loved fiercely even when love wasn't returned. That kind of woman doesn't break easily. That kind of woman doesn't stay silent forever. And as those memories swirled in my mind, I knew the next steps of my story were no longer about waiting for his love. They were about reclaiming mine. If you realized, after years of sacrifice, that the person you trusted had quietly neglected you all along, would you regret the years you gave, or would you see them as proof of your strength? Silence is often mistaken for weakness. People assume that if you don't speak, you don't see. If you don't shout, you don't feel. If you don't confront, you don't know. But silence has layers, and mine had begun to transform. What once was the silence of submission, the silence of a woman swallowing her pain to keep the peace, was slowly becoming something else entirely. It was becoming a weapon, a shield, and a stage where strength could grow quietly, away from his gaze. After the night I witnessed his betrayal in the hospital, I said nothing. Not to him, not to the nurses, not even to myself in words. Instead, I let the silence stretch around me, holding me in place like an anchor while my thoughts reorganized themselves into clarity. He thought my quietness meant ignorance. He thought my illness made me blind. But in truth, silence was allowing me to sharpen every detail, to collect every inconsistency, to study the man who had once been my partner and was now nothing more than a stranger who shared my name. The next morning, he arrived at my bedside carrying a small bouquet of lilies. His expression was carefully arranged, as if he'd rehearsed it in the car mirror. His eyes darted to mine, searching for the version of me he wanted to believe was still there, the trusting wife, the grateful patient. And I gave it to him. I smiled faintly, whispered my thanks, allowed him to think the flowers mattered. But in my silence, I watched him. I noticed the slight stiffness in his posture, the way he checked his phone when he thought I wasn't looking, the faint mark on his collar that no amount of excuses could explain away. He didn't know that while he played his role, I was studying his every move. I thought about how many times I had confronted him in the past with small doubts, only to be met with anger or dismissal. "You're imagining things." He'd snap. "You're too sensitive." I would retreat, chastising myself for stirring conflict. But now, I realized those were tactics. He thrived on my fear of losing peace, and I had handed him the power by staying silent in defeat. This time, my silence wasn't defeat, it was strategy. As the hours passed, I practiced it. When he told me stories that didn't line up, I nodded, storing each lie like a bead on a string. When he claimed he had to leave for a work call, I murmured, "Of course," while noting the urgency in his steps as he exited. When he avoided my eyes, I let him, knowing that guilt often reveals itself most in the things people avoid. Every detail became part of a picture I was quietly painting, a portrait of betrayal he didn't know I had already completed. But silence isn't easy. It demands control over instincts that scream for release. There were moments when I wanted to break, when my chest burned with the desire to shout, "I saw you," or demand, "Who is she really?" But I didn't. I bit back the words, letting them dissolve in the quiet hum of the machines around me. I reminded myself that storms shouted, but earthquakes moved silently, and earthquakes left lasting scars. I was done being a storm he could dismiss. I would be the earthquake he never saw coming. The nurses began to notice my quiet strength. One leaned down one afternoon and whispered, "You're handling all this with such grace." I smiled, but inside, I wasn't sure if it was grace or fury, disguised as patience. Either way, it gave me dignity. Dignity he couldn't strip away, no matter how many lies he told. For years, I had been reacting to him, shaping myself around his moods, his excuses, his absences. Now, he was the one moving blindly, unaware of how much I had seen, how much I had chosen to hold back. At night, when the hospital halls grew still, I replayed everything in my mind: the flowers, the laughter in another woman's room, the excuses that no longer held weight. And instead of crying, I began to plan. Not revenge. Not yet. But survival. Transformation. I began to think about what my life could look like if I stopped living in the cage of his lies. About what dignity could mean if I chose to reclaim it. My silence wasn't just about him, it was about me. It was the space I needed to rebuild, to rediscover the woman I had silenced for decades. When he left each evening, kissing my forehead with lips that tasted like lies, I felt something remarkable. Relief. Relief that I didn't have to pretend in his absence. Relief that I could breathe without the weight of his performance pressing down on me. And it was in those quiet hours, alone in my hospital bed, that I found my resolve. He may have thought my silence meant surrender, but it was the opposite. It was the birth of my strength. I promised myself I would not let him see my rage. I would not give him the satisfaction of watching me crumble. I would let him walk confidently into his own downfall. Unaware that I had already withdrawn my faith, my loyalty, my love. Silent resolve, I realized, is far more powerful than desperate confrontation. Because silence builds suspense, and suspense has a way of turning the tables when the time is right. And so, I waited. I let him believe he still held me in his grasp. I let him underestimate me. Because there is nothing more dangerous than a woman who has been betrayed, who has lost everything, and who has chosen silence not as submission but as preparation. If you discovered betrayal but chose to stay silent, would it be because you were too afraid to confront or because you knew silence could be your strongest weapon? There comes a moment when the weight of betrayal no longer crushes you, it fuels you. That moment, for me, was not loud, not dramatic. It did not arrive with shouting or tears. It arrived in silence, as I sat in my hospital bed, staring at the bouquet of flowers my husband had left, their petals already beginning to wilt. They looked beautiful at first glance, but up close, they were fragile, their stems weak, their leaves curling at the edges, just like our marriage. Something that had seemed strong, but had been decaying for years. As I watched those flowers droop, something inside me shifted. I realized I had been holding on to illusions, waiting for him to water a garden he had abandoned long ago. And in that realization, I felt my strength begin to return not just to my body, but to my spirit. My fever broke, my breath felt steadier, and though the force still tethered me, I knew I was no longer the same woman who had arrived at that hospital desperate for his comfort. I was transforming. The turning point began with small things. I started to eat again, not just because I needed strength, but because I wanted to reclaim control over my own body. Each spoonful of soup felt symbolic, like nourishment for a spirit that had been starved of dignity for too long. When the nurses encouraged me to walk, I did so with determination, dragging the 4-pole down the hallway, not just to heal my body but to prove to myself that I was capable of moving forward, step by step, even if it was slow. And then there was my mind. I stopped replaying his betrayal as a wound and began to study it as evidence. Each memory became a lesson. Each inconsistency in his words became a clue. I saw his actions not as daggers piercing me, but as maps pointing me toward the truth I had ignored for years. Betrayal, I realized, was not the end of my story, it was the beginning of my awakening. When he visited, I changed too. I stopped looking at him with pleading eyes, stopped hoping for scraps of affection. Instead, I watched him like a stranger. I noticed how he shifted in his chair, how his eyes darted when his phone buzzed, how his hands fidgeted when I remained silent. For once, I wasn't reacting to him, I was observing him. And in that shift, I felt the power begin to return to me. The turning point wasn't about revenge. Not yet. It wasn't about exposing him to the world or making him feel the humiliation he had given me. It was about reclaiming myself. I realized that for years, I had let my identity be tied to his actions, his choices, his love or lack of it. But now, I began to see myself apart from him. I was not just his wife. I was not just a woman lying in a hospital bed. I was someone who had endured sacrifice, betrayal, neglect, and had survived it all. That survival was not weakness, it was strength. In the quiet of my room, I remembered who I was before him. The young woman who had dreams, who had ambition, who had laughter that filled rooms. That woman had not died, she had simply been buried under years of compromise. And now, she was beginning to rise again. The real turning point came when I looked at him one evening as he sat by my bed, pretending to scroll through emails on his phone. For the first time, I didn't feel desperation or heartbreak. I felt clarity. He was no longer the center of my world. His betrayal no longer defined me. I realized in that moment that his choices said more about him than they ever did about me. And with that clarity came freedom. It was as if a veil had been lifted from my eyes. I saw him for what he was, a man too weak to honor his vows, too selfish to respect the woman who had given him everything, too cowardly to be honest. And if that was who he was, then why had I been wasting my strength mourning him? Why had I been doubting my worth, my dignity, my power? His betrayal didn't make me less, it revealed how much more I truly was. That realization ignited something inside me. For years, I had been waiting for him to choose me. Now, I chose myself. For years, I had been afraid of being alone. Now, I realized that being alone was better than being unseen. For years, I had been silent out of fear. Now, I was silent out of strength. The nurses noticed the change. They told me I looked stronger, that there was a new fire in my eyes. They couldn't know the source of it, but I did. It wasn't the medicine healing me, it was the truth. Betrayal had broken my illusions, but in doing so, it had built my resolve. And as I sat there, stronger than I had felt in years, I whispered to myself, this is not the end of me. This is the beginning. When someone betrays your trust, do you let it destroy your sense of worth, or do you use it as the turning point to reclaim your power? Strength is not always loud. Sometimes it doesn't roar in the face of injustice or scream in the wake of betrayal. Sometimes it hides, quiet but steady, growing in the shadows until it's ready to emerge. That was the kind of strength I was discovering in myself. It didn't arrive with grand gestures or declarations, it arrived in whispers, in patience, in the unshakable calm that comes when you finally know the truth. Every day in that hospital, as my body regained its health, my spirit discovered a new form of power. It wasn't the kind of power my husband would recognize. He thrived on dominance, on control, on making sure his words carried more weight than mine. But my strength didn't need to dominate. It simply needed to endure, to sharpen, to prepare. He came to visit, and I let him sit in the chair by my bed, his presence filling the room with a false sense of devotion. He spoke in soft tones, offering shallow encouragements, asking if I needed anything. I smiled faintly, thanked him politely, and let him believe I was still the fragile wife clinging to his care. What he didn't know was that behind my stillness, behind the silence he mistook for weakness, I was watching him more closely than ever. I noticed the hesitation in his words, the way his eyes darted toward the clock as if someone else were waiting for him. I caught the faint sigh of relief when I told him he could go rest, as though my permission freed him to run back to where his heart truly was. And with each observation, my strength grew, not because his betrayal made me smaller, but because it reminded me of how much bigger I truly was without his lies. The nurses, too, began to sense the change in me. You look stronger every day, one of them said, her eyes warm with encouragement. She didn't know the full truth that what was healing me was not just the medicine, but the clarity betrayal had given me. She didn't know that each time my husband left my room, I felt lighter, freer, more certain of who I was becoming. Strength often reveals itself in choices, and mine became clear. I would not confront him yet. That would give him power. Let him spin his lies. Let him twist the narrative to make me look foolish or paranoid. Instead, I would remain quiet, collecting each detail, letting him dig his own grave with every false word and every hurried glance. He thought I was weak, but weakness doesn't notice. Weakness doesn't remember. Weakness doesn't wait. I was doing all three. At night, when the hospital grew silent, I spoke to myself not out loud, but in the deep chambers of my heart. I reminded myself of who I was. I thought of the years I had carried my family, the sacrifices I had made, the resilience I had shown in moments when life tried to break me. That woman had always been there. Betrayal had not created her, it had uncovered her. My strength was not born of his lies. It was born of my truth. I remembered nights long ago when I worked 2 jobs to keep food on the table. Days when I sacrificed sleep to make sure the children were cared for, while he disappeared into excuses I chose not to question. I thought of how much I had endured in silence, not because I was weak, but because I was strong enough to put others first. And now, for the first time in decades, I realized I could turn that strength inward. I could choose myself. The hidden strength became visible in subtle ways. My back straightened when he entered the room. My eyes no longer searched his for comfort, they studied him with calm detachment. My voice, though still soft, carried a firmness that unsettled him, though he couldn't place why. He sensed something had shifted, but he couldn't define it. That was my advantage. I didn't need to shout to reclaim my dignity. I didn't need to expose him yet to feel my worth return. All I needed was the certainty that I was no longer chained to his lies. That certainty was power. And power doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it waits in silence, biding its time, until the right moment comes. One evening, as he left my room with the same tired excuse about needing to check on something at work, I felt no anger, no sadness. Instead, I felt gratitude, not for him, but for the truth he had finally shown me. His betrayal had stripped away the illusions I had been clinging to, and in their place, I found something stronger. Myself. Strength is not given, it is revealed. Mine had been hidden under years of compromise, buried beneath decades of loyalty to a man who didn't deserve it. But now, it stood tall inside me, silent but unyielding, waiting for the day it would no longer need to hide. Do you believe true strength comes from fighting loudly against betrayal, or from the quiet resolve to rebuild yourself in silence first? Time has a way of revealing what people are made of. Illness strips away the comforts, betrayal strips away illusions, and silence strips away lies until all that's left is the truth. By the time I was preparing to leave the hospital, I was no longer the woman who had entered its doors weak, fevered, and clinging to the hope of her husband's love. I was different. My body was still healing, but my spirit was no longer fragile. It had been reforged in fire. He came to visit that final morning, carrying a smile that looked more like an apology he was too afraid to give. He placed a bouquet of roses on my table, the kind he used to buy when we were newlyweds. Maybe he thought the gesture would erase the whispers I had heard in the hallways, the tenderness I had seen in another woman's room. Maybe he believed that nostalgia was enough to blind me again. But the truth is, once your eyes have been opened, they cannot be closed again. As he spoke, his words floated in the air like rehearsed lines in a poorly acted play. You'll be back home soon. We'll put all this behind us. Things will get better. He said it with conviction, as if saying it enough times would make it true. But I no longer measured love in words. I measured it in actions, and his had already told me everything I needed to know. For the first time, I did not feel desperation when he left the room. I did not ache for his return or wonder if he would call. Instead, I felt a calm certainty that whatever came next, I would be ready. His choices had already defined him. Mine were about to define me. When I was finally discharged, I returned to a home that no longer felt the same. The walls still stood, the furniture still sat in its place, but the atmosphere had changed. It was no longer a place of love, it was a stage where lies had performed for too long. I walked through each room slowly, taking it all in, realizing that the life I thought I had built with him was nothing more than an illusion carefully maintained. And illusions, once broken, can never be rebuilt. Days later, the phone rang. It was him. His voice trembled with the urgency of someone who suddenly remembered I existed beyond the hospital walls. He asked if I needed anything, if I was managing on my own. He slipped in mentions of bills, responsibilities, obligations, as if to remind me of all the practical ties that bound us. But what he didn't know was that I had already untied myself in silence long before. He began to call more frequently after that, sometimes with concern, sometimes with requests. There were hints of guilt in his tone, though never outright apologies. He wanted access to my patience, to my forgiveness, to the comfort I had always provided him. But I was no longer the same woman. The calls no longer stirred longing, they stirred clarity. I understood now that sometimes the greatest blessing is not being loved, but being ignored, because in that space of absence, you discover your own worth. I didn't tell him about the strength I had found, about the fire his betrayal had lit in me. I didn't tell him how I now stood taller, even when alone, because I had stopped waiting for someone else to validate my existence. I didn't tell him that the silence he thought was weakness had become my shield, my foundation, my power. Instead, I listened. I let him talk. I let him circle around excuses, weave half-truths, and beg for normalcy that no longer existed. And in my silence, I knew I had the power to decide the future, not him. For the first time in decades, the decision was mine alone. Would I forgive him? Would I confront him? Would I walk away entirely? The answer lay within me, and I wasn't ready to reveal it, not to him, not even to myself. Because sometimes the power of a story lies not in the ending, but in the choice to leave it open, to recognize that life is not about neat resolutions but about the strength to keep walking in uncertainty with dignity intact. I thought about all the sacrifices I had made over the years, all the times I had put his needs above my own. And I realized those sacrifices had not been wasted. They had built me into someone stronger, someone capable of enduring heartbreak and still rising with dignity. They had made me resilient. They had made me unbreakable. And now, standing in the aftermath of betrayal, I understood that my story was not one of loss, it was one of transformation. Sometimes being ignored is the greatest blessing. Sometimes silence is the loudest voice. And sometimes betrayal is not the end, it is the beginning of a life you should have claimed all along. If your partner betrayed you in your weakest moment, would you forgive them to preserve the life you built, or would you step into a new life, stronger and free?